first, I want to thank everyone for being here, panel as well as the guests. I know they're still going to be kind of floating in here a bit, but this panel is kind of brought to you from A+D Architecture and Design Museum. And the title of this series is Identity, Aesthetics, and the Built Environment. And this panel kind of came about maybe about 6 months ago or so, in like March or February. And as we were kind of, my own work with unearthing a Black aesthetic and working at the museum, we kind of ended up in this mutual partnership where they're, sponsoring and really partnering with me to, try and get this work done. So it inspired us to reach out to other designers, artists, architects, everybody in the field to kind of get everyone's opinion on this. When you're saying something like a Black aesthetic, you can't really be saying it individually. You can't give a blanket statement and say it's for everybody, and it's very collaborative. And so this is the goal of this, is to kind of get views from different kind of people in different avenues of design, art, architecture, development. And so, yeah, we'll pretty much get right started. So I'll start with some introductions. So first we have Christopher Locke, who's co-founder of Designing in Color and Small Talks LA, also a designer at ZGF Architects. His work challenges the established practices of architecture from the perspective of a Black designer, spatial advocate, and social innovator to create new spaces for change. Currently located in LA, he moved to the city after graduating from the University of Michigan with a master's degree in architecture. And
just one correction, Demar. I work at Egan Simon now, not ZGF. So shout out.
Oh, apologies. Yeah, Egan Simon.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So next we'll have Duane Gordon Jr., co-founder of Jet Design Development. Duane is a developer, entrepreneur, and self-taught artist who goes by the title Originally Distinct. He's a Philadelphia native that studied business management and entrepreneurship at the Lincoln University of Pennsylvania and graduated with a bachelor's degree of science in 2014. While at Lincoln, Duane founded the lifestyle brand Handwritten Culture, which has a focus on the culture of creativity. He started his full-time journey in entrepreneurship in 2015 through a real estate company and through various art forms, which led him to co-found a platform for artists and creatives around Philly called BU Society.
Honor, thank you so much.
Sure, thanks for joining us. And next we have Aminatou Fall. Aminatou is an art director, makeup artist, educator, and architect.
You there for a second.
In a b-boy freeze.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. All right, you good.
Gotcha.
You good.
Good.
Got you. Dramatic pause.
All right, I'm back. Sorry, Natu, let me get back into you.
No worries.
So Natu earned her Master of Architecture from SCI-Arc in 2019. She has held teaching assistantships in SCI-Arc's Pop-Up Art and Design Immersion Days programs. Her SCI-Arc graduate thesis project, Shaping Face, which earned her the Gary Prize, awarded for the most outstanding graduate thesis project, aimed to reestablish cosmetics in architecture as including thickness, feature enhancement, exaggeration, ornamentation, and other transformational effects that empower individual expression of identity.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Also currently faculty at SCI-Arc, so back there a year later teaching, which is great. It's nice to
Much respect to you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Nice.
And last but not least, we have James Garrett Jr., founding partner of St. Paul's Formula. By uniting art with architecture, James Garrett Jr. creates dynamic spaces for the 21st century that demonstrate a commitment to diversity and equity in the profession. A visual artist and writer who was formerly trained as an architect, he gives voices to underserved communities and is deeply invested in the human experience. He has made it his mission to reconnect art and architecture. His work combines resiliency and dynamic expression in the form of vibrant color and diverse media, as you can tell by his background. And James, I missed anything? You need to add anything off of that?
Just that I'm licensed in Minnesota, New York, and New Jersey, and we opened a New York City office of Formula about little over 3 years ago. So we're venturing out into New York, have a couple full-time employees holding it down out there, and trying to get multi-coastal on cats.
That's what's up. Congrats on that. I didn't even know that you guys opened that office there. Congrats.
Yeah.
See you in LA real soon.
We're working on it.
So my name's Demar Matthews. I'm associate curator at A+D Museum. I'm also founder of Off Top Design. But this really ain't about me. So let's get into some questions here. So really, we're exploring this panel. We're kind of exploring how identifying with the built environment, what the effects of it are, whether you do identify with the built environment, whether you don't, and specifically for Black Americans who are one of the only cultures who don't have a defined architectural language. So really, I guess I'll kind of pose the first question. Anyone can feel free to answer first. Is identifying a culturally proprietary aesthetic or architecture important?
I'll jump in real quick. I think that it's definitely important to have an architectural language and a built environment that reflects the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of the people that live there. So regardless of who those people are or what those experiences would be, it's definitely important. I think it's part of the human spirit. It's something that you need to have a built environment that reflects, who you are, your values, and have that daily affirmation when you get up, when you go home, etc. So I would say it's 100% important, and it's something that we, as the people, have been deprived of for the past, really 500 years since we've been in this hemisphere. So trying to reclaim that, trying to figure out what that is, trying to explore, different ways to communicate that, I think is essential, especially in this moment.
Yeah. I agree. I think, the built environment is also one of the ways we, document history, right? And so not seeing yourself in your environment or in the built environment, not seeing your culture or your people sort of reflected, really it sort of emphasizes this sense of like otherness that a lot of Black people and people of color carry, that is affected, like it affects our psyche, it affects our how we sort of relate to each other and to the other people that we share this country with.
Yeah, I would definitely follow up those two incredible responses by saying it is essential and important, as it is that we do not repeat the processes in which modernism created spaces in this country and throughout the world. If you dismantle that process of building rationale into the world that controls and dominates people by using the Black aesthetic, I think that's totally paramount. And I think the process of creating a Black aesthetic is, to me, more important than just the aesthetic itself, because it's that process that then can be repeated to create and rebuild and unbuild what we would consider racism in the environment. So I think doing those things and that are so keen in the process of getting the right people involved and dismantling those power structures and those privilege structures that have historically kept people out of the process of making space. Because as human beings, we can appropriate our environment just as much as anybody who's trained in design. But the world has taught everybody that you need to function inside the systems of which have been created to define our world. But we understand that culture is really the response to us surviving. So I think if design and Black aesthetics can really appropriate that and give that a platform, I think that's where we could really make some impact.
I totally agree with Chris, and I think just living life and constantly just seeing things evolve, things have to change, things have to be innovated and spoken into. So I believe even with Demar working on his project and introducing the Black aesthetic for architecture just to the world right now is something that a person may be scared to do, because at times, I think when it comes to trailblazing path, you may have individuals that may feel timid or may have this emotion that holds them back. But then when you have power to believe in something and introduce something and get the world familiar, that's the innovations and the mindsets that changes the world and pushes things forward. So I believe it's important.
Yeah, I'll even take it a step further, and say that in our experience, unique to us as a people, we have not had the opportunity to have control over our own built environment really in any real way. Certainly since the 1920s, when Black Wall Street, Rosewood, Fifth Ward, all the violence that took place to take those sort of Freedman Town era, Reconstruction, Constitutional Reconstruction era, cities and towns and villages we created. When those were taken from us, we really haven't had any opportunity to have control over the built environment. Most of the buildings that we occupy and inhabit are not new, right? Most of the neighborhoods that we're able to move into, it's because another group has moved out into something presumably better. And we've been able to then move in behind them, whether it's Harlem, whether it's, everywhere. I mean, it's a universal thing. And so if you take it back a step and you say, okay, who designed this building? It wasn't somebody that looks like us. Who built this building? Probably wasn't, a builder that looks like us. Oftentimes we weren't even allowed to be in the buildings. At the time that the buildings that we inhabit were built, we weren't even permitted by law in a lot of places to even enter and do business in those places. So, I mean, there's a whole nother level to this aesthetic conversation that goes to control over the built environment and being able to even have something that speaks to who we are and even serves the way that we live and the way that we occupy space. So to me, that's, the real estate development component is another level, and being able to do for self on that side allows us the space to be able to ask the questions. What is a Black aesthetic? What would we do if we had our own opportunity, without sort of the control of the property and the real estate, which we really haven't had in about 100 years. Without that, none of these questions can really be answered or experimented with.
James, I agree. I think, the process of sort of establishing a Black aesthetic or starting a conversation about one is really like an act of resistance towards this sort of systematic erasure of our identity in every sort of like way possible, right? Because when we start to think about like even neighborhood revitalization projects and things like that, it's like this sort of wiping of what's existing and like starting anew, erasing the history places hold, erasing the neighborhood, and sort of I almost feel like it's sort of an act of like reclaiming control or sort of taking a stand and you know, pushing, like sort of pushing back against that process.
Yeah, the whole modernist project,
Yeah,
which what
100%.
Chris referenced, is like that is literally the enemy of all things that have dopeness and flavor. It is literally, I mean, and I talk about things in terms of the third wave, right? That first wave coming out of slavery, Reconstruction, into sort of the Black Wall Street sort of era, and then having the Ku Klux Klan and having the Black Codes and having the citizens rights organizations come and violently burn down and destroy what we built. And then from that, people dispersed from the South and the West and came north to occupy the cities, right? So Chicago, Detroit, the Twin Cities here had a huge influx during this great migration, right? But we hunkered down. We found our own sort of voice. We found commercial corridors to sort of occupy and make our own. We had Rondo Avenue in St. Paul. We had so many all over. And then in the 1950s, those were, the power of eminent domain was used against us by the state to create the freeways, during the Federal Aid Highway Act, 1956. So then, our neighborhood got completely, destroyed and demolished in virtually every single city across the country, right? So the modern project in this act of erasure, it hurt us economically, hurt us culturally, two different times. So the businesses that are emerging now and the conversations that are happening now are really a third wave, right? This is a third wave because a lot of the things that were destroyed, we weren't even born yet. So we don't even have a legitimate memory of experiencing, Black business, Black commercial corridors, Black this and that. That was taken before our generations were even, born. So now we're trying to like find our way and, we're trying to figure this out. But, it's been a systematic erasure through violence, either individual vigilante violence or violence of the state over the last, 150 years, that's putting us in this place where it's really urgent that we try to set ourselves, find our bearings again, and find, another way forward in this kind of third wave, as I like to talk about it.
And one of the key words, I wanted to jump in real quick, Demar. One of the key words you put in that question that I want to just quickly address is proprietary. And it's that ownership that everybody's talking about that through historical revisionist practices we haven't had. But like using the musical references, owning your masters is something that Black culture has to, through design, has to embrace. And when we look at the process of how we work, owning that, putting terms to that, putting that back into education and back into practice, teaching that to people who look like us, but also teaching to other people that, hey, if you're going to use this culture and you're going to use this work, you better make sure you reference it and center Black voices and brown voices as a part of that process, because it's absolute paramount to when you're looking at the propriety of owning that and gatekeeping that work. Because if anybody could pull up reference and then say, hey, I'm gonna do a Demar Smith right behind your head, I'm gonna do a Demar Smith Black aesthetic design, and you see that popping up all over New York City, and turn to find out it's some white dude who's going to Pratt, who's pulling up your work, but you ain't getting referenced in that at all. That's a form of appropriation, but not through the fact of celebration. It's just through the fact of control and using that. So I think if we could figure out a way to continuously populate this work, which is why I love what Beyond the Built is doing with Pascal and some of the other things that No More are doing are incredibly important.
Yeah, I think, we actually had this conversation in a panel that James and I were in with Sekou last week. And it was exactly about that, because I've been speaking to classes about this, this idea or, the development of this idea of unearthing a Black aesthetic, and always make sure to tell them that I am not the first person of this idea. I'm just I'm doing it now, and I'm one of the people who are trying to do this work now. And a student asked me if he went and if he was inspired by the work, and he said, if I go and do work in a Black community, can I use what you did?
A non-Black student.
Yeah, a non-Black student. Yeah. And so we were discussing, is that appropriation? And he asked, and I felt weird about it. And I was thinking, on one hand, yeah, it's appropriation. But then I was thinking, what if he just goes into this neighborhood and makes this design that has nothing to do with our culture, and so I kind of felt that it was kind of on us as the Black designers, or me at the time as a Black designer, to lay out the steps correctly, for him to be able to follow. But there's other sides. And James, what do you think? Me and James were on the
Yeah, I'm derided as the gatekeeper of culture all the time, and I wear that. I feel like it's super important to do things that are authentic and to work on things that make sense to you in terms of your lived experience, your spirit. One of the things that I've been traveling around speaking at state architects conferences and universities all over the country over the last few years is, art integrated architecture. And so for me, art integrated architecture is hip hop architecture, because that's the culture that I was raised in. That's what I've written about, throughout undergrad, grad school. I've been building this narrative and working on this from my unique ethno experiential point of view for the last 20 years, right? So for me, I represent hip hop architecture as a means of exploration of this aesthetic, right? But what I tell people is that it's really not about hip hop or about any one sort of genre or sort of avenue to approach it. It's about bringing art and architecture back together and reuniting them in the built environment. I mean, you go back to Egypt, you go back to Persepolis and Persia, you go back to, the Mayans, Incas, Aztecs, etc. There was always art integrated into the architecture. There was no separation or difference between the two. And so what I tell people is that if you're coming from a culture that's not hip hop, you cannot do hip hop architecture. That is absurd, that is ridiculous, and stop it. But there's plenty of other things you can do. If you're part of jazz culture, if that's something, there's ways that you can integrate that into the work that you're doing in the built environment. If you're part of, any other type of cultural sort of movement and expression that you've authentically lived, then I encourage those types of explorations to try to bring the built environment and sort of artistic expression back together, sort of, again, as a pushback or a rebuke of the modernist project, which sought to separate everything and to eliminate, any form of craftsmanship and, flavor and detail, and like standardize everything and package it.
Got rid of the curry.
Yeah, exactly. So, so whatever cultural background you have or wherever you're coming from, like there's a way for you to be involved in this conversation, but do not step to me as a person who grew up in hip hop culture and try to, well, I really like hip hop music. And so I think I should, and it's like, yeah, no. So that's just real.
I mean, I'm not going to disagree with that. Let me pose another question for you guys, and that's who you actually spoke to kind of two of these things earlier. You spoke about the mental effects of not identifying with your built environment, and since you are also, I remember you posting your thesis project as I was in school and I was following it, and it just looked so different than work I was used to seeing. Once I always thought SciArc had a specific kind of style, and it wasn't like you just broke from that style. It's like you broke from typical architecture, I guess, ways of representation, visual representation. And so, yeah, I was wondering what are the mental and social effects of not identifying with your built environment? And
Well,
to you,
I mean, yeah, I think just to sort of repeat what I mentioned earlier is that it's just this sort of lack of identity in your built environment, like reinforces this sense of like otherness, like you don't belong here. There's no like built traces of like your family's history or your people's history. Like all of that sort of adds to or sort of compounds the like generational trauma that a lot of Black people carry in this country. And I think like you know, that sort of plays out in social interactions, like minor things, I think, like just like not sort of being able to like find a sense of community based off of, or like create a sense of community that's like reinforced by the environment that the community lives in, just sort of support that community in its like development and in its growth. um yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to like add to that. You're muted, Demar.
I don't want to put you on the spot. I have one more. So
No, it's fine.
for
Yeah.
how you how you how you approached your aesthetics when you were doing your thesis work, um, how did you specifically, when I was looking at how you used makeup, I was thinking, or I thought of it as, if a black woman is to look for makeup and the makeup just doesn't match her skin tone, then is she gonna feel like she is meant to wear this makeup? And I just sort of related that into this, and so I was wondering, or,
Right.
or sorry,
Well,
if you can.
I think, I mean, I think that in my thesis project, I was looking at like the makeup artists I was sort of using as my study cases were like makeup artists of color towards the end. And I think like I wanted to sort of touch on something that turned into a trend in the beauty industry with like the launch of um, Fenty Beauty. Like this, you know, not being able to find your shade in a foundation is like the equivalent, I think, to not seeing yourself in your neighborhood. It's like, okay, so this is not actually for me, then what is, you know? And sort of having to struggle to like find brands that actually will make the effort in, or put the effort into developing products for our skin tone, or like a larger sort of array. Because prior to that, I think there was only like 2 or 3 brands that made like a wide range, right? And so when Fenty Beauty was launched, it was like, this stuff is actually affordable, and there's like an incredible range, like this is for everyone, right? And so um quickly after that, like other makeup brands that, you know, are sold in the sort of beauty supply store, or like a CVS or a Walmart or whatever, like started to provide those like similar types of products. And it's like jumping on the bandwagon to sort of be like, wait, actually, we see you now, you know? And it's like, it took a Black woman to be like, hey, actually, we're gonna handle this, because clearly no one knows what we need. And like, me being a Black woman, like, I'm gonna produce this for other Black women, men, whoever, that just to like, you know, it's a way of sort of acknowledging like other people's existence. It's like, you're here, and this is for you, right? And with my thesis, I think like I was just trying to like tip my hat to that, like, because the sort of houses I was studying were in South LA. And so I wanted the houses I designed to reflect the neighborhood, right? And so if we're talking about makeup, we start to, you know, there are connotations on skin and color and things like that. And so each of my houses got a different dark skin tone, right? To just like even touch on the fact that like not all Black people have the same experience, the same history, the same color skin, even though we share the same like culture and like label when we're out in the street. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was like a long-winded like, but I hope I
No,
answered.
it actually leads me perfectly into the next question that I'll pose for anybody to feel free to ask. And Natu kind of just gave her take. And she gave one way of how she is doing it. So this next question really is, how are Black designers fighting against Eurocentric design approaches taught in architecture school? And anybody can kind of feel free to jump at that question first.
I think pulling references is a big one, right? Like just looking at work that isn't from, or architecture that isn't from the like Beaux-Arts, like, regime, or like, line lineage of like pedagogy, just like, I think also like a big part of like Black culture is just like remixing things, so like taking certain references and reading them a different way, um, or sort of making comparisons that are like not at all alike but could be, just sort of thinking outside of the box, and also calling things out as we see them. Like if there's, a reference that's made that's very Eurocentric, sort of acknowledging the fact that it's very Eurocentric, and acknowledging the fact that there's some dark history there, and living with that, like it doesn't need to be this sort of like tense, awkward, like, oh well, this guy's like a racist and had slaves and all of that. It's like, yes, this is facts, and it doesn't need to be this thing that's like weighing on everyone. It's like, we're acknowledging this, and yes, it's messed up, and yes, X, Y, and Z, but here's its significance, and here's why we're sort of looking at it, right? Yeah, I think like acknowledging the fact that, architectural learning or education is incredibly Eurocentric is like the first step to sort of breaking away from all of that.
Yeah, I did it through critique. That was the main strategy that I had, was I just critiqued the hell out of it every chance I got. And, I got threatened a lot with, I'm going to fail you. You're not supposed to say that or whatever. And I was like, well, fail me. This is the best paper in the class. From a technical standpoint, it's tight. My argument makes sense. I can back it up. I've got receipts. So it didn't fail me. And I never got failed, but it was always that threat that, as the only or one of very few students of color, in class, it was like, we're going to hang this over you, that you're supposed to view this a certain way through the lens that I want you to. And so I critiqued it. I did a lot of juxtaposing. I wrote a piece called Resonant Spaces, Dynamic Flows, about 2003. I think it was the first paper of mine that got published nationally. And that talked about hip hop and architecture. It talked about the built environment and its sort of interlacing with culture and the significance of it. And so I was doing things specifically, like I would take like excerpts from papers from Manuel Castells, from Berkeley, Saskia Sassen from Columbia, some of the top people that were urbanists and talking about relevant issues. And I was juxtaposing, I was putting Raz-Kaz quotes and Tupac quotes, and and I was making an argument, sort of undulating back and forth between these two sort of polarities that people don't think that these things go together, and saying that not only do they go together, but they lead to this result. And then I was creating an architectural aesthetic based upon that sort of juxtaposition, and that was really rejected a lot. That was pushed back against a lot, but it was a form of critique, and it was also a form of saying that some of the things that, the urbanists that are highly respected right now are moving towards are things that are literally being said in the hood, through hip hop music and culture and other means, and that one is not superior to the other, that these things can sort of go together, and that there can be an aesthetic conversation between, those two different polarities. So those were the two kind of strategies that I tended to use when I was, working through the academy.
Duane, you want to jump in? I know you.
So yeah, I think that's super dope. And I think anytime you're, I guess, going against a norm, something that's a norm, you take heat. You may take heat in the beginning, but then at the same time, you're educating the uneducated on what you believe in. And I think it's necessary. And I think that answers both questions that was just answered, in my opinion.
Yeah. One of the things I would say, and all three of you said it beautifully, about critique and about precedent. For me, one of the big questions that is fresh in my head, because I just gave a workshop on this last week, is this is the question that a lot of educators get asked, and Atu, you might starting to see this when you work at SciArc, is how do you contribute to the profession? That is one of the basis questions that white educators and practitioners ask, is what does it mean to contribute? And it's one of the roadblocks that a lot of Black designers and people in academia face when they're starting to question how can they contribute, or how have they contributed, or the references they use in contributed. And I think demystifying that and starting to create a basis of what that actually means is important, because if I read off these percentages to you that's from this presentation, it's so damning. 0% of all architects who have won a Pritzker Prize are Black. 1.3% of AIA Gold award winners are Black. The only one who won is Paul Williams from LA, and that was after he died. Yep. AIA Topaz Medallion, 0. The Distinguished Professional Award, 1.3%. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And when you look at how the profession has centered white voices historically in the practice of understanding design, saying that Mies van der Rohe and people like Philip Johnson, who supported Nazism in his work, yep. When you center those people at the center of your studio, you are structurally building racism back into the world, whether you are conscious or unconscious. And that complacent practice, yep, of doing design in the world is completely racist. And I think it's important for people who are practicing at the SciArcs, at the UCLAs, where I used to go to school at Michigan, where I just gave a workshop at last week at University of Massachusetts, to understand that the precedents and the culture that you create in your studio is an example of how students will practice in the future. They take the critical conversations, the vernaculars that we use, the terms such as juxtaposition and all these other terminologies, and then they put them back in the world. But what about colloquialism? What about the vernaculars that Black people use every day to describe space? What does it mean to describe how the barbershop influences how we construct and create festivals in our communities? What does all that mean? If we could construct those languages a little bit more into how we formulate space, because they're already being done. But if it's done in the context of a studio, you can make so much more remixes and so many more different ideas and typologies of how students can practice. And the last thing I would say, and this is something we talked about at the University of Massachusetts with a lot of my old professors, and this is, I think, very important. You have to create a studio environment and a curriculum that doesn't decolonize how people think. And if it's completely structured in that white is right all the time, and the references are pulling from that direction, and you are not creating any interest in intersectionality between, as you would say, James, art and practice, or sociology, or music, or anything of that, you're doing yourself and the students around you a justice, whether they're Black, white, or whatever. Because when we go out into the world, we've been taught that aesthetic is the first thing you structure. When I've always gone to SciArc and I've gone to even Michigan, the first thing you see that's talked about is form. Form is the driver of design, like as if the shape of what we do changes human lives. And then the other thing that I've always heard that always bothers me is like, yeah, like marginalized communities deserve to have pretty things too. That doesn't change how we construct and stuff. So I think for educators, it's incredibly important for you to start creating new systems for how students can enact safe space around them. Because if we can't, we're just repeating the same shit over and over again.
Yeah, that's 100. That's 100.
And also, I think for any artist or designer, whatever it is that you do, it's a duty for all of us to express culture and your social beliefs, your beliefs within your design. I think that's how people learn more about your design, learn more about your aesthetic, and learn and become more interested. And that what that does is pushes things forward.
And for this last question I'm gonna pose for you guys, so we can leave some time open for the last 10 minutes for Q&A. You know, we all know that, I mean, two of you, James and Duane, are both in development. We all know how important a developer is kind of to or how critical a developer is for architects. And so now as we're looking at possibility or the development of Black aesthetics, how can the architecture or how can the architect and developer relationship be a tool in this work?
Well, I can say this. So the name of my company is Jet Design Development, and we're a homegrown creative company. And intentionally, since us being homegrown, intentionally it takes for us to utilize our resources and our relationships. So over this time, and look, I'm learning every day as a new developer. And for me and Demar, we went to college together. So we 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 talked about what we're doing now. So intentionally, it's for me to work with Demar and being a homegrown company. It takes for both of us, or it takes for me and Demar to kind of to express our beliefs within design and for us to work together to create aesthetics. So with Demar, I'm a student at the end of the day. So with Demar and some of his beliefs, I'm learning, and then I'm also using my aesthetics that I believe in to kind of integrate within design. I think that creates a nice finished piece of art. So I think it's super important, just the developer architecture relationship, because today I think when it comes to development, it's more about what's cost effective or what's cost efficient for the developer to kind of build something and also turn profit, and not really just looking at the bigger picture of you building something that's going to stand and also be a reference for others later down the line.
Yeah, and what Duane is speaking about is me and Duane have partnered for properties that he owns in Philly to design and put on market, and it's in majority or predominantly Black neighborhoods. And so we'll just be sitting there in Rhino or whatever CAD together, looking at how something will affect a community. If Duane comes from the sides of numbers originally as a developer would, and some of it he already knew, and some of it I would pose questions like, well, what's this mean for the community? What can we give back? And then we work together to really be able to get something out that we're proud of and that we think the community can be a tool with. So that's what he was referencing. But yeah, I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really development is key and critical to really everything. So we need more developers that look like us. And basically, if you can formulate a team, right? My philosophy is you put a squad together that's talented, and you design a process that reaches out for means of understanding the stakeholders, the end users, and you're intentional about how it's going to affect the larger community. The aesthetic will figure itself out. The aesthetic will emerge, right? But it emerges from that sort of combination of having talent and having the right type of process together, and then having the space to be able to explore things. A lot of times that space is taken away when we're dealing with real estate development because of the way margins work, and people like to take whatever the last shitty thing that they did before, and then that's the starting point. Whatever the last abject mediocrity, building that we just built, we're going to literally take that, and then we're going to, chintz around the edges here and there, and then we're going to represent it as a new thing. And there's no criticism of it, there's no analysis of it, there's no interrogation of what that is and why that is and how does that work, and is it really serving the people that live there now. There's none of that. It's literally, we're just literally going to take, and then we're going to manipulate a couple things, and we're going to repackage, and we're going to present that as a thing. And that is absolutely a way to fail, and a way to basically entract mediocrity into the built environment, which is like literally what we have now. So process, talented people, and the space to be able to ask questions and gather information will end up with something dope.
Yeah, I think That's 100%. I think education and execution is the two big things. You know, coming from my side and practicing architecture and also trying to be part of education and educating communities as well and uplifting community voices. One of the things that I think is also important too, you know, a lot of the work that design and color engages with is capacity building. And it's ultimately how do you center communities in the process of building spaces so that they are knowledgeable and understand how to use those tools later on. Because one of the things I've witnessed most recently when I was on a Watts community neighborhood council meeting is there's always a lot of questions about what exactly is going on. And there's a lot of not trusting the process because the process is either fraught or it's historically marginalized and silenced the voices who have been angry for such a long time. And when you put all those things into a vacuum, what often happens is the developer gets pointed at first. It's always the developer. The architect is on the side, just chilling like, ooh, okay, I don't know if that's me or not, but like, you know, I'll just watch. And I think part of that, what needs to happen is it needs to be considered in this process that James talked about is how can architects, and ultimately the process would be different. It would look more like what James is talking about. Right now, for many other places and firms, especially these big, large firms, developer comes to them and they do the service. But ultimately, if you're practicing design justice and you're seeking liberation in the project, how can you educate your client and your developers about what's the right way to do the process and the work? How can you center communities? Some people aren't interested in that shit. Some people just want to build a building and get the profit margin as high as they can and move the hell on and get that the city tax breaks while they can and just move on. And as designers, the code of ethics you need to start asking yourself is, are you going to participate in the building of racism and gentrification and displacement in cities? Is that something you're going to actively involve in? And if you're going to step your toe into that pool, how are you going to challenge it and change it? How are you going to ultimately try to create new structures with the collective of people that you work with to redefine who that is? How do you uplift nonprofits in that work as well? So I think the architect developer relationship is one that needs to work back and forth. And I've seen it here in LA and talking to a few developers offhand. And it really comes that there are people who are just deep seated and rooted in the proliferation of money. So how do you really combat that? I'd be curious what you think, James, but that's something that I always found as a challenge.
I'll just say this because I want to hear what Natu has to say about it. But from my standpoint, there's an architect here named Rick Carter who he said something that resonates with me to this day. He said something many years ago talking about green architecture, and I apply it to all different types of architecture. But his quote was, "Green architecture doesn't cost more, it costs differently." And that's how I feel about, you know what I mean? All my projects have been, you know, on time, on budget. You know, we've created like some really interesting aesthetic, you know, aesthetically, you know, interesting buildings, but we've never went over budget to do it, right? But we've strategically and intentionally made different decisions and choices with the money that we did have to make sure that these things were able to be integrated into the project, right? So it doesn't cost more, it costs differently. And that's what you need to start telling these people in terms of pushing back when they talk about the, you know, the profit motive. Profit motive is fine, but I mean, there's a different way that we can arrive at the end result and arrive at a qualitatively better end result, you know, by just making different decisions.
James, I think that's a great point. I think that I understand why that resonates with you a little. You know, I think for me, I haven't had too much experience with it myself, but for me, the sort of architect developer relationship is incredibly important when it comes to sort of giving architects of color opportunities, right, to build, because that sort of getting a project is you know, the architect sort of depends on a developer to sort of support them in that. And I think, like, you know, sort of the fact that there aren't that many Black architects out there, you know, it's almost on the developer end to reach out to Black architects and architects of color that are out there making work, and tapping them for bigger projects or projects in predominantly Black or POC neighborhoods, right? And I think like that sort of or working towards that and working towards providing more opportunities and more projects for Black architects is going to, you know, support and move forward this sort of movement of like establishing an aesthetic.
For sure. For sure.
Well, now we're wrapping up. We're in the last 10 minutes, so I just want to be able to give us a chance to answer a few of the Q&A questions. So I'll start here. So one, this isn't necessarily a question, but it was a comment. It said that it feels essentialist and reductive to create, I'm assuming it's to create or to continue the development of a Black aesthetic or a Black architectural language. Would anybody like to jump in or feel any sort of retort at that comment?
So, I mean, I don't agree. I think if anything, it's the complete opposite, right? Because Black people as a people historically have given so much to like American culture. And so to not have an aesthetic that's been identified and sort of created and established by us is like unfair is like not even like unfair is like an understatement. Do you know what I mean? Like there's nothing reductive about it. If anything, it's an additive, or it's sort of emphasizing and adding to our position, our history, our you know, our like even acknowledging like the fact that we are American, you know, like there's so much in this there's so much about Black culture that is appropriated and turned into stereotypes, you know, and that sort of you know, I think like the built environment's like the first place where society's like influenced, right? And if Black people are seen in the built environment as these like, I don't know, you know, some people it's like
Commodities.
right, exactly, we're commodities. And even and that shows in our economy, you know. Black people are only here to sort of be inspired by or to sort of pull from, but to not actually
Be a creator.
formally be acknowledged, you know. I think yeah, that's all I gotta say to that. I don't think so at all.
Yeah, it's an absurd, I just feel like it's an absurd proposition to even put out there, and it really doesn't merit, you know, us wasting time on it. I mean, obviously, Black culture has been at the center of hip hop music, which is now basically just accepted as global youth culture. Fashion, all fashion starts on the streets, and the streets of the neighborhoods where we live. Fashion doesn't start in the suburbs, you know. Everybody comes to the neighborhoods where we live to find out what the next thing is. I mean, so to not apply that same like concept to the built environment is just, it's lunacy. So I just, yeah, anyway. Next question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have something else to say as well. And I think for the architect, the artist, or anyone, we are in control. So we need to hold architects, artists accountable, you know. And I think, Demar, you're doing a great job by expressing your beliefs within your design. And I think every other architect, but everyone is different at the same time, but I think it should be a norm of architects also practicing, and artists, designers, wherever your culture is, to embrace that within design. And then I think things will push forward even more.
I think it's essentialist and reductive that Black and brown bodies are reduced to numbers on a screen and headlines and the continuous cycle of news over and over again as tragedies. That's what's reductive. I don't think it's reductive at all for our environments in which we've been placed. We didn't just come here by choice, most of us, whether that be from Jamaica, where my family's from, or that be Western Africa, the islands, wherever. We were placed here. So there's a continuous action to feel like you belong. And imposter syndrome, we had this panel, James was on it, and it all comes back to that. You feel like you just don't belong. And you consistently are put in the challenge of what's the lawscape, how is the environment continuously politicized and created as a jurisdiction versus that of your atmosphere and how you just belong in culture. Because culture is how we respond to space. You know, how you create murals and how you create safety in space. That's all a part of how we create culture. That's the only way in which Black people were allowed to survive in this country, is because of culture. So if we celebrate that culture, we put it in a place in which it's respected, it becomes proprietary by being gatekept to who has access to it and who can use it, and we center Black and brown voices, that's not reductive at all. In fact, that's Afrofuturism. That's the beauty of where we can all get. Because at the end of the day, if we all as a society, and I say all because I'm looking at the United States as a whole, if Black lives duly, truly matter, then everybody's bottom line is so much better. And I as a simple conversation, I never really understood why that statement bothers so many people. Black lives matter. I've had even Black people tell me that all lives matter. And that becomes a whole other conversation. So it's only reductive when you simply put the lives of Black and brown women and people and how they identify as nothing more than a headline. There's nothing more than that.
We have a couple more, but we're going to run out of time, so I'm not even going to pose them. But really, just to kind of put all this together and end it, this idea, this whole thing came from looking at LA really and other predominantly Black neighborhoods that are experiencing displacement or have experienced displacement and gentrification and et cetera. And, you know, I always wonder what happens to the history or the culture there, you know, once the displacement happens. And I always thought that having this sort of cultural imprint or cultural stamp on the built environment that's permanent and that's grand could mean a lot for, you know, for the people who grew up there. And that's if you're speaking of Inglewood, Watts, South Central, Chocolate City, you know, any of these places. So I think that having a culturally proprietary architecture or aesthetic is vital. But I think we're about wrapping up, and I just want to be able to thank all of you again for attending. Natu, James, Chris, Duane, it's been a pleasure. I owe you guys all the favors I can give you. And I'll definitely make sure to send an email so we can connect, and we'll put this online for you guys to be able to share. But yeah, I appreciate you guys very much for being a part of it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. So glad to have met all of you virtually.
I'll send an email so you guys can all connect, and I'm gonna hook it up. I didn't do a good job at the beginning, but I'm gonna hook it up on the back end.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Have a good day.
Take care. Have a good one, y'all. God bless.
Yeah.